Hello and welcome to the 8th episode of Speak Up by Smiley Movement. I'm here with some wonderful guests and today we're going to be talking about sustainability, the climate and education. Maybe just to kick us off, guys, if you could just quickly, we'll go around starting with you and just very quickly tell me a little bit about you and the organisation that you're currently representing today.
Well, hi, it's really lovely to be here, Abby, and hello to the Smiley world. My name's Cindy Ford. I'm a children's author, and I also founded a small company called Planetary, which is dedicated to Earth-led education. So it's about redesigning, really, from the earliest years, how we enable our young people to think, to equip them to be able to navigate our largest global challenges. And in my hat as an author, it's really about telling new stories for Earth, so we develop our connections with the natural world.
Perfect.
Thanks, Abby. Hello, my name's Anthony Bennett. I'm Chief Executive of Reboot The Future. And we are an NGO which is focused on delivering the 17 Sustainable Development Goals through an ancient maxim, which is treat others and the planet as you'd wish to be treated. And we specialise in doing so through culture and leadership and education. So we're here today to talk about education, and one of the things that we have in our portfolio is that we manage a community of 18,000 educators and teachers who are all interested in bringing sustainability into classroom learning resources through our free-to-air platform called globaldimension.org.
And finally, last but not least.
Hello, Abby. My name is Richard Dunn. I'm a former state school head teacher. I was a head teacher for 18 years, and now I'm director of an education charity called the Harmony Project. And we are putting sustainability and nature at the heart of learning. So working with like-minded people like Cindy and Anthony, really trying to look at how we can shift the focus so that we're still ticking off the national curriculum boxes, but just doing it in a more connected, meaningful way.
And as, you know, somebody who obviously worked in schools, you really do have like some skin in the game. Like you've been there, you've seen it like down in the trenches. And I guess from like your perspective, what is the situation like right now?
It's a very good question. I was speaking to a head teacher this week who's doing some really wonderful things in her school up in Lancashire. And I said, you know, what's the mood out there? What's the climate? And she said, for the most part, it's fearful compliance. So there's a real sense of fear that you're going to get things wrong or do things wrong in some way. And you're very accountable for that. And therefore you have to be compliant. So I think probably the most creative people are working out how to do things in a better way, but still be compliant. And that's the challenge. And I think there's a lot of pressure on people in education right now, right through the system, you know, from the school leaders into the classrooms and the teachers and support staff. So it's difficult. And I think we need to find ways, and it'll obviously be part of our conversation today, to bring back a bit of joyfulness and lightness. In some cases it's still there, but also this real sense of purpose that Cindy was touching on just now around how we live in the world.
And Cindy and Anthony, is this something you've seen reflected sort of in your work and your experience working with schools and educators?
I mean, I would say that if you're able to bring these subjects into the school, the children love it, the teachers love working with it. You know, it is something that brings people alive. It's, you know, it's fascinating, it's delightful. That the barrier is, as Richard says, having the mandate to do that. I mean, I work sometimes within schools, but my focus is kind of build new models, don't argue with the old ones. But that to really get something substantial into schools, it will require a governmental mandate. And with the kind of leadership that we have of the country right now, you feel that's going to be some time coming, but doesn't detract for us from advocating for that for sure.
Yeah, so we ran a survey of 7,000 teachers in England and Wales just late last year, and we were asking them really just that question as to what are the obstacles that teachers are experiencing in terms of bringing sustainability into the classroom. And just to double down on what Richard mentioned there, you're now looking at a teaching community which has come through COVID, which continued to work through COVID. There's no working from home for teachers particularly. And now through a period of kind of economic retreat, shall we say, you're seeing that the classrooms are becoming places of where all the stretched living circumstances of parents, all the real anxieties that families and people are feeling generally, the classroom is the sort of societal hub where these are visited, and teachers are becoming de facto, as it was ever thus, I guess, but teachers are really on the front line of all the anxieties that parents and children are feeling. And then against that, what we wanted to, there is this sense of, ecological catastrophe is one of the things on the menu. So we didn't want sustainability learning to become yet another damn thing on the list of things that we want teachers to do when they've already got a very full plate, and teacher retention and recruitment are, in real crisis as well. So I guess our kind of starting point is about empowering teachers, giving them agency in the classroom and thinking about what that means. And then I guess the second point is actually changing perhaps the nature of what we're learning and what we're focusing on in a time of real societal anxiety, when mental health amongst young people is a real crisis point too. And thinking about actually what is a real kind of cultural shift within learning and within the classroom look like, and how can we empower that?
Absolutely. And as you very rightfully said, teachers have a lot going on right now. They're very much overworked, underpaid. So how do we introduce talking about sustainability, about the climate, in a way that isn't going to cause more stress and harm to both teachers, parents and the children who are learning about it? Sort of an open question to the floor.
One of the positive findings from our survey was that so the good news is that the Department for Education has created there's a mandate for climate education within it. What there is a deficit in terms of resourcing, and what we found was that there's 3 times as many teachers want to become that climate lead within the school as is absolutely required for. So that the willingness is there for teachers to do so. What's absent is training and resources and substantiating that capacity to do so. So I think the Department for Education has said that it wanted the UK to become, or wanted the English curriculum certainly, to become the world leader in sustainability learning within schools. I think we found that there's 83% of teachers were actually unconvinced that the UK would be the world leader. So I think there's a lot of really good teachers who are improvising on the spot within their classroom practice. There's lots of good learnings that we can share on a peer basis. But I think there's something in there about closing that gap between what the government said it wants to happen and actually what it's resourcing to do so.
I think just to add to that, we have to see it as a both and. That this is not a compromise, it's not going to lower standards. In fact, it's the opposite, isn't it? Our experience would be that when you do this kind of learning and it is relevant and meaningful and engaging and has that lovely sense of vitality that you were talking about, Cindy, then it's the best learning. So it isn't an either or. We have to see that this can create the best curriculum possible and it will still keep standards high. There needs to be a bit of give in it though. I think what we're seeing is it's so full, the curriculum's so full, and people, as you've highlighted, feel so under pressure. We've got to just relax that a little bit. I think that's where the space will then come to be creative around all these important ideas.
I think it is important to be proactive as well. I mean, obviously, I'm a creative, I'm a writer, so a book I wrote that came out last year is called Bright New World, and that just, it's big, it's bright, it's beautiful, it's got fabulous illustrations. I didn't do the illustrations, a wonderful friend who's an illustrator did, but it tells the story of the world that we can have. So instead of overwhelming people with despair and with this sense of, this is a burden that we have to carry, it actually puts each section steps us into the future of what our oceans could be like, our food systems, our transport systems. So you can see this is a brilliant world that we can have, and there's nothing in the book that is, and then it has a roadmap of how so this is what we want, this is what we can have, how do we get there? And every step, it shows where we are now, and then the map looks at the things that we'd need to do to have this much brighter future. And everything that we need to do is utterly possible. It either exists or is in an embryonic, most of it does already exist. Some of it's in a more embryonic form. But the trickiest thing in there is how we think, which brings us back to education. But to tell the story in a way that is really engaging and really positive, you get people lighting up. It's just this sense of hope and possibility rather than this. And it does cut right across the curriculum. There's room for this in maths, in music, in art, in geography, and so you can work with it right across. And I think if you put something like that into the system, I know you have lots of lovely resources on Reboot the Future. You give teachers this wonderful thing that they can work with, and in a way it can be smuggled in because it does fit in the curriculum in so many different ways. But it's a really positive engagement, which I think is where the power lies of the kind of work that we do.
I think one other thing there is this whole being greater than the sum of the parts. That if you take a theme or a project or an inquiry of learning, and you then draw the subject-specific content into that, it's actually a smarter, more efficient way of working. Whereas a lot of schools still will use separate schemes for every single subject. So from a child perspective, you go from one scheme and one textbook maybe into another, and it's very siloed and segmented or fragmented. So I think if we can be more holistic around how we learn and really draw things together, it just works better.
Yeah, and actually I wanted to touch on like a point that's come up sort of between the three of you as well, is that you talked a lot about positivity, and I think there's sort of a culture, at least from what I've seen, of wanting to bury your head in the sand, being worried about the environment, being worried about climate change, and a lot of people just sort of throwing up their hands and going, oh, well, we're in this terrible situation, there's nothing we can do, so let's just not think about it. And is that sort of the case within schools? Is that something that we can combat? Because obviously there's a massive increase in like climate anxiety within kids and young people as well.
Yeah, so we would say, I mean, my own personal feeling is if you're not scared, you're not paying attention, right? So there's a very legitimate reason to feel anxious and anxiety about this. The second negative to lay down is that my own personal feeling is that we're not going to stay within 1.5 degrees. Okay, we're consuming more fossil fuels than ever. We're looking at, within the next generation, the next 10, 15 years, a massively transformed world in some way. Just before we came in, Rich and I were talking about farming and food and how we're going to have to change our whole attitude to having strawberries all year round, for instance, at the very least. So what you're looking at, you need to start thinking about these things in terms of the medium to longer term, rather than short-term panic. And SDG 4 is all about education, so it's one of those 17 mandates the UN has put in place. And I think the second next best thing we can do about climate change is start investing in our future, and the classroom is the place we can do that. So over the period of the last few years, we've worked with people like the Fridays for the Future movement, the initiative that Greta Thunberg started, and the young children, including my own, who've been on classroom strikes and standing at the school gates and saying that this system is insufficient to our needs. There comes a point when actually you start to say, well, it gets a bit cold, and actually they're standing at the school gates, what do I do next? Where do I go with this? And what we want to suggest is actually the classrooms are the places where we're going to fix the climate crisis. The classrooms are the laboratories for the future, and give young people a sense of agency within there and say, okay, this is where we work it out together. That will require, I think, a values shift within the classroom. So at Reboot, we talk a lot about values and what those kind of necessary values are to create a life economy. But certainly that young people, children, students are, if the future is it was a business, then young people would be the biggest shareholders, right? And I think there's certainly, you extend that kind of metaphor to say that 60% of young people, that's to say people under the age of 35, are in the global south as well. So we need to start thinking, if we talk about empowering youth in classrooms and agency, we need to extend that learning and start thinking holistically, certainly within the curriculum, but also to what it means to empower young people on a much bigger and broader basis, and what we can do most usefully from where we stand. There's a Scottish environmentalist who uses the phrase, you dig where you stand. So you're kind of making sense of the world from the classroom outwards.
Oh, thank you, Richard. I do think that maybe I'm lucky because I don't spend so much time in the classrooms when I go into schools. It's to engage with young people on this issue, and there's just so much excitement around it. I think people are really, the young people, you know, of all, you know, different. You see that much more in the secondary schools. They're so aware of what's going on, and they're so aware that the curriculum, as it is now, is just not equipping them for the world as it is right now, and as it will be. So when you bring something else in, they're thrilled, and they've got so many ideas. I mean, you know, again, going down to really young children, they've just got it. They're all over this stuff, and there's so much less limits to their imagination. You know, if you say design a sustainable city, design a house, some of the concepts they are aware of, they've heard, some they're inventing for themselves, but they're things that are really possible. And you know, that when that energy gets into the room, then you get this fantastic, you know, this creativity emerges, and you have this real sense of positivity. There is something that we can do about that. You know, we can do it in the school, whether it's whatever I design, or wherever I'm engaging, whatever even if it's one thing that you leave behind that is simple, that can be done, that carries on growing, then you know, I think that's a real key, and really trying to get that, yes, have a sense of, you know, the bigger picture, how our world works, but to get that tangible thing that you can get your hand on and that you can do. I think it just can flip that switch from this despondency to agency, and I found that, you know, really delightful and powerful as well. Yeah, really encouraging, because there is so much we can do about it. We have a lethargy at the level of business and the level of governments, or a fear, or just a complete co-opting into the fact that there is only this system. But all around us, you know, people like in the Smiley community, Richard, Anthony, and this whole body of young people, they know those days are over. They know that there's another world possible, and when you give them the sense that they can be part of building it, they really, I think there's a hugely strong reaction to it. It feels like death happening up there, and maybe that will compost, and these shoots will come through the soil. Yeah,
such a brilliant metaphor.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, and I think there's a huge sense of that in the youth, and the thing is to feel not that you're and in communities like ours, not to be smothered by it, but to have that energy, that creative energy, to grow through it, to compost it, and become something different.
Yeah.
I think we should start a band, Cindy, called the Death Composters.
Sings only environmental political punk songs. I'd listen. That would be great, I think.
I mean, just to give you a nice example of what we're talking about, when I was ahead, we were looking at climate change, obviously a massive agenda, but then looking at that in terms of energy use in school. So one of the year groups was responsible for energy. They did the monitoring using a software system, very easily accessible, very easy to understand as a child in a primary school. And they measured energy, set targets, and then rewarded the school every week for getting below those targets. So it was a very positive thing, and it was an ongoing thing. And I think sometimes I have a concern that environmental issues could be a one-off event, a one-off theme, day or week, or in a particular year group linked to a particular project. So if we can embed it and just make it mainstream it, then I think it really does become part of how they work. So those children in that year group knew that they were responsible for energy monitoring, and they knew there was always a reward if they did it well, and to be honest, for the staff as well. Yeah. So then it became, you know, the campaigning for climate became a real reality for them, and they felt good because they were doing something to make a positive difference.
Yeah, I think that's so nice to and this idea that you all have of like introducing it sort of systematically like into the curriculum, because you know, thinking back to when I was in secondary school or primary school, you know, 10-15 years ago now, which is scary, but we did Earth Day and that was sort of it. And you know, individual teachers would say things to you, like, you know, like my biology teacher would mention something. You know, I specifically remember having like a conversation with our librarian of all people about like aerosol deodorants and things, and you know, kids saying like, oh, they're not that bad for the environment, you know, it's not that serious, and her saying, well, you know, it's not doing any good either. But those were the only conversations that we had. And it doesn't sound like it's changed massively, and like you said, those one-off things, they don't stick necessarily.
Yeah. For me, I think part of the agency that schools, there's a kind of unexplored power that schools have for change. So I'll give you a couple of examples of that. Is schools are the place where children learn to eat, where they learn to dine, where they have communal dinners. So there's an important part of socialisation around that. And you saw, for instance, in lockdown, Marcus Rashford's campaign, when you realised that schools were the one place where children were getting a square meal of the day. Mm-hmm. So all of a sudden, the poverty indices become very evident when the school's not there. So think of places as schools where children learn to eat, and therefore what the exploratory nature of that might be. Another example, it was quite a successful campaign in London in recent years where you realised all these Chelsea tractors that were piling up outside the schools at rush hour, and that the fumes that were generated where the most vulnerable people were the tiny people, right? So you had these great big SUVs that were generating lots of exhaust fumes. So therefore, actually, schools at year level were the most polluted places in London.
Sorry, did you call them Chelsea tractors?
Well, you know what I mean.
Sorry, I think that's really amusing. I really like that.
I don't mean to be classist about it. But great big cars. And so the point being that actually all of a sudden that became a trigger for people to learn about how much air pollution there was in London, because the schools are these deeply socialised places. You know, they are places where people care very deeply and they send their children, and therefore they feel that sense of vulnerability and engagement. They're also places of community where people gather and kind of take stock. So I think it's that kind of attitude. If you want to unlock social purpose with schools, they're great places for people to feel that sense of exposure and engagement with their communities as well. And I'm kind of interested to ask Richard. I don't want to go too track, but you've done your time in the coalface on this,
right.
And now you're. What's the comparison between being in the weeds, as it were, being in the school and trying to enable this as a kind of individual unit within the system versus stepping outside and seeing the overview? Do you have a sense of empathy with teachers?
It's a good question. It's quite frustrating because when I was a head teacher, obviously you can influence what goes on in your school, and you liaise with your team and your governors and your parents and community as well as the children. So you start to build a culture around it. And then I think if you do it well, it then draws people to that school, both in terms of parents wanting to have their children there, but also just interest. Whereas now I can see our role is much more about hand-holding and working alongside schools to say, let's take this from an eco club and an extracurricular thing, and let's start to put it into your curriculum. I was thinking when you were talking then about the air pollution, you can do so much great maths. We were talking about energy monitoring, but air pollution and pollution levels and percentages or whatever it is that the data you're referencing. And you can start to use that as the real life application of your maths. So nationally, we'll have lots of schools using math schemes like White Rose. But actually every week, if they started to use their maths in an applied way, even simple things like, do you know how much an apple weighs? We're thinking about local apples or, seasonal food, and start weighing it and then getting really good at weighing it like you would in a fruit or vegetable. Suddenly it's alive. And I think we need to do more of this. We need to find these opportunities within the mainstream system of the curriculum to say, this is how we can do it. And then they'll love it.
Yeah. Just a little comment on the math. I thought it was one of the biggest ironies of Rishi Sunak's move to make people do more maths at school and up till A level. I mean, there is such a huge opportunity with maths there, and he's entirely incapable of calculating the carbon budget. So it really felt a little bit.
Maybe he's doing what he wished was done.
Yeah, exactly. Whereas, but even with things like that, there's a story to tell of how Earth works, which works on mathematical principles. It is a simple question of maths. We can't do this because of that. The oceans can't get on any hotter than this temperature because of that. You can use it in really applied, and then tell the positives if we reduced or if this happened. But there's so much that we can learn around the principles of universe, the principles of nature that can be applied to any subject really, and that was
I guess from even just a purely educational point of view, not even taking into account growing these young minds into sustainable kings and queens and various monarchs, but even just from an educational point of view, what have you surely it's better to learn these things and get to know these principles with like real world applications that you can like imagine and see and touch and experience.
Yeah,
because I hated maths, but like, you know, when you think about the maths behind sustainability and the science behind, you know, energy like calculations and things like that, suddenly it becomes much more real and much more tangible and easier to learn as well as more enjoyable.
It really does, and I think there's a paradox. I don't know whether we'd get to it sooner or later, but we're trying to fit all this learning, all the things that we all work on, into a cultural narrative that doesn't really want to hear it either, or it hasn't evolved enough to understand that we're not post-industrial revolution. We're not in this, post-colonial. Really, other place I do a reasonable amount of work is on colonisation and climate change. Which, in understanding that, you have to understand a whole different, how our philosophy was constructed, how our worldview was constructed, that led us to this point. Whereas in school, that worldview is still incredibly dominant, and so there's a real disconnect between this. We really are pioneering education for a world with a future, and we're trying to find a bridge to connect that with, with an education system that's still pumping out, or still very much centred in a worldview that has essentially brought us to this point of collapse. As Einstein famously said, you can't create solve the problems with the same thinking that created them. But at the levels of schools, the curriculum is still being taught around, or the thinking that created these problems. And I've been with Richard speaking with bigger educational providers, and the schools say, we can't do anything because of the exams, because you've got to be examined against these criteria, and then the education bodies that set the exams are too terrified to move away from that, because of course they exist to serve this overarching system. You're producing young people that will come out and fit into this and carry on this model, which is making a few people very wealthy, but a lot of people, it's underwriting the collapse of our life support systems. And so you start to go out from the eco club to the school to think you get to this macro, which is a dominant world view, which we can see in the forces of Putin, of Trump, of the way that our governance structures are set up for corporations, what's legal and what isn't, and so it is a really big struggle. Actually, it's a big project to try to turn that around. But again, school is the place to do that, because if you can get in one story that's different, children wake up, they remember them, they read, To Kill a Mockingbird, or to something that had some profound influence on how they think. So on the one hand, sometimes I do get up and think, oh God, this is insurmountable. But you put a good book into somebody's hand, or a song, the power of music, or even a witness in a different type of dance, and these things can start to to put, it's like ink in water. They can start to change the whole the whole colour of it, if you like. But I think being aware of what we're up against is really huge, because it's a systemic, it's a worldview that's holding this system in place, and it's very hard to challenge that. But that obviously is what we do, and I think as a storyteller, that's what I'm working on more and more. And wonderful storytellers like Ben Okri, like Amitav Ghosh, they've put out these really beautiful calls to everybody in the business of educating, of telling stories. This has to be our overriding mission. This is freighted with such huge moral urgency that if we're not doing it, we're part of the problem, really.
And sorry, carry on.
I was just going to add, coming to the survey that Reboot The Future did, which I think, Anthony, was England and Wales. They're very interesting case studies, aren't they? Because we have in England, where we are right now, we have a very controlled system. It's a very full system. There's not much scope for movement and flexibility, linking to what you were saying, Cindy. Whereas in Wales, they have their Wellbeing of Future Generations Act.
Totally.
They have a much lighter curriculum. We do plans for half terms. And one of the people I work with in Wales said, actually teachers here would see that half term as a whole term of learning. So let's go deeper. Let's give it relevance to the context of our school, in our community, and our place. They have a lovely word in Welsh called cnefin, which means rootedness, a sense of place. So let's bring it to life within our place, within our community, the diversity of our community culture, what the stories and the history of that culture. And suddenly it really has just a lovely feel to it. So we've got two systems running at the moment that are very, very different. And I think in Wales, probably there's an element of trying to work out quite how that curriculum works, because it's still early days. But there's definitely a sense that there's more freedom, more space to innovate, to be creative, and to make it work for that school and that community and those children, which is obviously what we want, isn't it?
Yeah, and what I've sort of heard from all of you is that really there needs to be systemic change to create space in the curriculum for this joyful learning that we know that kids are capable of and know that they want and know that the teachers want, but there just isn't the room. It's all packed in like Tetris blocks. So how do we, what is the first step? How do we create that space for this all-important education?
I think for me, it's, one of the messages that's coming out of the survey was empower teachers, trust teachers, give them agency. As you say, have we can't function with no curriculum, but have sufficiently, a light touch approach whereby teachers are empowered with it, and they have security, they have job security, they have agency within the classroom, and that they feel invested in themselves. I think that's at least part of it. That's what the part of the kind of huge anxiety issue that schools face is about teacher burnout, and I know teachers that are going into school this month crying before they get to the classroom.
Absolutely.
So there is. I think it's giving that power to the teacher is teachers are, as Richard said, they're super restricted and they disempowered from making this call.
May I ask you, Anthony, then, how do you see that giving of the power? Who has the agency to give the power to the teacher?
I think it's it's about localising kind of reform at the school level, for sure. I think there's probably like a necessary conversation about how punitive things like Ofsted inspections are, and the sort of huge cloud that hangs over the school itself. I think it's about resourcing, which is to say, paying teachers equitably. I mean, very kind of good functional stuff. That there's a lot of stretch in public sector resources just now, and in a sense, teachers become the last bastion of those strains within the community as well. So I think you start with teacher well-being, and in a sense, the well-being of the classroom and the students flows through that as well. As I said, in the survey that we mentioned. There was one of the headline stats for me was a majority of teachers feel that they're not preparing students sufficiently for the future, and that, in a sense, if there's a core job for teachers, that's it right there. So we have to attend to that, and I think part of giving the assurance will spread through the class if teachers themselves feel that they are trusted to do their jobs. So I'm always about listening to teachers. I think that's why I'd asked that question of Richard, is actually teacher voices are kind of very necessary in this process.
Yeah.
It is about trust. I think you're right. We need to trust the profession more and give them that opportunity to be creative around it, because if we don't do that, then they will leave, they will get burnt out, and that's the reality of now. I think we've had, in the DFE here, we've had a kind of leadership there which has been very focused on knowledge-based learning. And actually now we're probably thinking more about, okay, well, what do you do with that knowledge? What's the use of that knowledge to these young people's lives and their future? And that shift away from what is, I think, still a very backward-looking curriculum. We're still looking very backward with a particular lens, as you were highlighting earlier, Cindy. And how do you get a better balance between looking back and then thinking about what is the future that we are going to create? So we need that.
I just wanted to pick up on your comment there, Abby. We need systemic change. I mean, there's almost a disempowerment when we say things like this needs to happen, that needs to happen. It's like, what are we going to do about it? Because we are, as you've highlighted, rather grimly there, Anthony, you know, the 1.5 is gone. You know, we are in absolute code red. So I think it is up to us, really, to actually do something about it. We have to be the systemic change. We can't just kind of put it over there. It has to be something that we work towards. So as well as creating this youth that you've done brilliantly, the models, the resources, I also tell the stories about them. There's a huge piece of advocacy here as well, in terms, I know you're very much involved in that, because we do what we can, we build the new models. I think that's very much what we're all involved in, build the new models, certainly for me, rather than arguing with the old ones. Somebody has to build the new models of what this is going to look like, what it can be, demonstrate that, bring it into being, very, very much what my focus is, and at the same time as making this very active challenge to call for this systemic change. I think it's got to come from the inside and the outside as well, and I think that is just right now, this time. As Eldridge Cleaver, it's another famous quote, but it was him actually who made it from during the civil rights movement. If you're not part of there's no more neutrality. If you're not actively part of the solution, you are part of. And I, sitting there in these neutral positions, saying, people do get upset and they say, "Oh, this needs to happen, this needs to happen." But if you can take one small step yourself, even if it's just a small thing, you have a sense of power, and it is taking back that power now that we need to do on a very individual level, on the teacher's level, school level, and actually calling for the kind of world that we want to see. We've mentioned as we came in, there's all these elections going on this year globally, and it'll be so interesting to see how we as a force and ordinary humans use those opportunities. I know it's hard, and I know that the narratives are skewed against us, but it really is a time to just do everything that you can to push for the change that we need, and it affects every level of our system, particularly what happens in the schools.
Yeah, and it is possible. I think we have to show that it is possible within the system. I mean, that's what I did as a head teacher, was to show that you can do it.
Yeah.
And it doesn't compromise standards, and it creates the best learning for the children. And then everyone gets behind it. And, we know there are lots of pressures on data and things like that. But we can find a middle ground that still keeps standards high, but does it in this much more purposeful way. And I think really for me now, it's about helping people see how they can do it within their system, their school, their context. And then others can be inspired by that. And then it will have a ripple effect. But I think if you give it as an alternative, it's hard. People say, well, that's all very well, but we have to show, in a state school, for example, in London here, or wherever it is in the country, that it can be done.
I think the things are going to get hard. Right? That's a given, and I think we have to embed compassion within our structures. And I think saying you have to be comfortable saying that out loud, because it doesn't sound very business-like or corporate, but actually we need to be able to give full expression to that in our institutions, and our school is a place that happens. So I think that idea of extending empathy, extending a sense of well-being, of actually addressing the mental health crisis, for instance, and actually being able to say to ourselves and each other, I'm not doing so well today. How do you feel? Having a sense of exposing that sense of vulnerability. I think that's at least part of the toolkit. Just as I would say, you want one thing to do. I asked a similar question to my other half as I left the house today. She's a teacher. She teaches garden schools, and so she's my control group of one. And I said, what's the one thing I should say? What's the one thing you can do to empower schools or students? And she said, give them a trowel. And I think there's something in that, because one of the things that she does is that she has a school garden, and she gets the kids to grow potatoes, and then they take them to the school canteen and prepare them there, and they eat them. And for a lot of kids, especially in our London kids, which is where she teaches, the idea that you'd eat something that's been in the ground, are you kidding me? That's been in the soil. Are you crazy? So there is that sense of disconnect, and I think that simplicity of connection with nature is something that we have to relearn again. Just to learn the value of the food in your plate and learn the value of the people, the people who brought you the food and the value of the farm that the food came from. I think that sense of interconnectedness is key, and thinking about, again, where you are in the world, how you can stick your trowel in the ground.
Yeah.
Richard and Anthony, may I ask a question about that as well? I mean, I have close friends and family who are teachers. I totally know that burnout when people are going in, they're just stretched to the point of there's just nothing left to give. How do you see I totally agree that bringing in compassion and empathy, those are qualities that it was really quite painful to hear you say that. It doesn't sound very business-like. No business should be in business if there's no room for compassion and empathy. That is part of relearning how we have to be here. But how what's the reality of bringing that into schools today? Because people go into this, fearfully into the system where you just said you barely feel comfortable using those words. So how do you feel that very really can be brought into schools, given the pressures that they're under
There's
today?
a very interesting field trial running at the moment. Well, just about to start. It's the second one in support of the idea of something called a nature premium, which is to provide funding for schools. And the question is exactly where does that funding come from? Is it public, private? Is it a partnership? But providing funding for nature-based learning. Now, with that funding, you can either get someone to come in and train and skill up your staff. You could provide resources. You could maybe bring someone in, like a gardener, to come in and work alongside the teachers so that they're not worried about it, that they feel confident that they've got someone who knows what they're doing. So it's a really nice way of just saying, let's take our science learning outside this half term. Let's work with someone who can really help us. And at very minimal cost, you can really start to change things. And then that lovely sense, as you say, of the trowel and the feeling of the soil is there. So I think these are the sort of ways in which maybe we can explore it.
That's really beautiful, Richard, without a doubt. And in the interim, while we're waiting for this, even if it's a small amount of funding, in an East London school where there isn't any funding, where everybody's stretched to the max, what can you say? What can be done to bring this compassion in the now, without a magic wand of money, it's a challenge. I work with people who are in that situation, and it's all very well for me to come in with my beautifully brightly coloured books. I can do school visits, I can do things, but what can we leave behind that's actually going to change how they operate every day?
Well, to give you some good news, some of the schools we're working with are in East London, and so they're part of this field trial. I think beyond that, I think schools can look at their communities, look at their academy trusts, if they're in an academy trust, to say at very minimal cost, it might be a few £100s, that this would support this shift of learning. So what we're seeing, there's a funny example. Schools often have, at the end of the autumn term, some kind of fair or fete or event, and they often get estate agents to fund it. And they'll regularly fund. It'll happen all over the country. Estate agents are notoriously good at funding these kind of events. Summer Fete as well. So if you say to them, we'd like to do something, I'm putting this out there.
It's good. It's really good.
Would you support our school with nature-based learning rather than a one-off event? Just to help us to shift this with £500, £1,000, £1,500 maybe. I think that's where the change can happen. We have to do this locally, because I think you're right. The big picture of it, it's such a juggernaut. It's so difficult to change it.
I really love that, actually, that reaching out to to partners in the community, because that's the other thing that I find quite. I possibly like you, Anthony. Kind of moving between worlds all the time, from the governmental departments to corporate worlds, and then you go into schools, and there's a disconnect, isn't there? And when you invite things like that, because we are part of an ecosystem, and those connections have been broken, but it looks like a small thing, but it links that. It brings the community back together. It puts the it brings the balance back. There's a scarcity of resource in the school, but there's a wealth of creativity. So the estate agents brings their few £100s on them, but in return they get this fantastically creative thing that happens in the community. And so those kind of cross fertilizations, I think, are really beautiful and powerful.
They're really key, aren't they? And I think when schools are outward looking and really looking to engage with their wider community, that's when really interesting things can happen.
I think I've lived in London for 25 years now, and one's experience of London is completely transformed once you have a child and you send it. And I assume it's pretty much standard experience. Your experience of any neighbourhood is transformed when you all of a sudden you start to engage with the local school, and it's all of a sudden a kind of invisible city emerges of connections and resources and people, and neighbourly instincts as well. So all these things are dormant, and I think we can amplify them. We can resource them and emphasise them. I also think, in answer to your question, I don't really think I've ever met a teacher for whom it's just a job. I think teachers, enter into the profession with, even if it's just a sort of invisible thing on their shoulder about compassion and empathy and engagement and loving to see young people, like sprout and emerge and come good. That's kind of, I think that's kind of hardwired into pretty much. If it's not a teacher, I don't think there'll be a teacher for long. So I think talking about compassion and empathy is it's baked into the proposition, and it's unlocking it, and it's about enabling teachers to do so. And just if there's one takeaway, like I would add to that thing: pick up a trowel and put down the phone. So I do think that the idea of e-learning, online learning, lots of the big sort of tech interests who are interested in this space, you might take that with a pinch of salt. And I'm supportive of schools that are very prescriptive about children having mobile phones in the classroom and things like that. I think the idea of having a ring-fenced space where we're kind of free from the sort of predatory intakes of techno-capitalism, where actually kids aren't being sold things or being asked to display themselves. Those kind of mechanisms for empathy and compassion, I think they start when you turn to the person on your left or right and learn how to talk to them and learn how to listen.
Totally,
So enabling that kind of environment within schools for listening and engagement and genuine and learning empathy, I think maybe starts with putting down the screen.
And I hate to draw this to a close, but unfortunately, I don't know about you guys, well, I'm sure, but like I could just keep talking about this for quite a while longer. But just like from like the sort of the final question as we wrap up now, ending on like a positive note, of course. What do you envision the future of education being like if we're in a world where we are teaching kids about sustainability, about the planet, and about living in harmony with nature? Maybe start with,
I'm happy to start from a harmony perspective, which is that we absolutely have to live in harmony with each other and with the world, the natural world. And in fact, nature is brilliant at teaching us principles that can help us to do that. And that's certainly the foundation of a lot of our work. So I think if we can, linking to what Anthony just said, if we can try and get learning to come out of the classroom a bit more, into the natural world, the gardening world, the whatever world it is. And you can do that in an urban environment as well as in a more rural environment. So we shift the focus. I think if we are able to thread this sustainability agenda through the curriculum, so it's not another thing to do, it's just doing things in a better way. And then this message that we've been consistent with today around empowerment, agency, leadership, giving our young people a role and a voice in all of this, and saying, actually, we are listening to you. As you said earlier, Cindy, they've got so many great things to share. And that if we do that and we get the balance between the academic stuff and that right, we will create the best learning. And that's really exciting, isn't it? I think that's where the hope is.
Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely.
And yourself, Anthony?
I think when schools are working, many schools are working and are great productive places. They are safe spaces. Very often they provide the only stability that a lot of young people experience, and so you want to build on that, amplify and build up, and think of where they are creative spaces, enabling spaces. as I said before, we want those climate strikers to actually view the classroom as a place where you can fix things. Right? That's the space where these things are going to work. And again, you think of that sort of 14 to 18 or 16 to 25 category where people are looking at the next stages beyond school. And young people 16 to 18 years old, they're quite right to be angry, because those great kind of promises of put yourself in debt, get a college degree, and then you'll get a mortgage. All those things all those promises are starting to kind of unravel a little bit. So it's not the case that you'll necessarily be able to afford your first home now. Young people can see that coming up. So I think we have to, that for me is when I say this is where the climate crisis is going to be fixed. It's because you're actually going to say, okay, let's start with an assumption of what is planning 10, 15, 20 years look like in advance, and start thinking about that now. And that is, I think, the most powerful space that we could occupy just now in terms of legislation, in terms of economic planning, thinking of what green jobs look like, and actually having that discussion with young people now, right? And say, look, actually, what is a green job? What is that in a meaningful sense as well? And there's also, I think PwC released a report last year that said 50% of CEOs don't think their company will be around in 10 years' time. So we are living in incredibly fissile times. There's a lot of discontinuity and turbulence in the mix at every level of society. So creating schools as safe environments where we can play and practice and fail and permit failure as well. But enjoy creativity and enjoy those kind of exploratory conversations.
And finally, Cindy.
Oh, well, thank you. I think that we are a very young species. We're very sometimes we're very clever, sometimes we're very silly, but we are like a 2-year-old really in terms of where we are evolutionary. We're working out how to live on planet Earth. I think that the crisis that we're in, the polycrisis, is terrifying and dangerous, but it is also a massive opportunity for transformation. And I think if we learn from it, then we have the possibility to actually step into a better world. Yeah. And I think that world will be, any education in that world will have moved away from this egocentricity to ecocentricity, will be earth-led. Just a little metaphor for the human family, our success model that you're talking about, the mill that you're put on because the carrots dangle, that you'll be successful. And how can you call a human family successful when 62, I think is it 80 men? 80 men own 62% of all the wealth on planet Earth. If you looked at that as a human family and there was a brother upstairs who has warmth, who has food, who has so much stuff that it's falling out the window, and everybody else downstairs is freezing and half starving, and some people are dying, would you call that a successful family?
Of course not.
It's monstrous. And I think that we're at that point that we're waking up to that, and we're waking up to the value system and the belief system that's led that to look like success. And there is this huge opportunity for us to transform, and at the root of that will be, and you asked what will education look like in the future, it will be earth-led, because any intelligent creature lives in harmony with its life support system, and that's what we have to do, and that's what has to go to the heart of how we learn.
Yeah, amazing. Well, we've had a really fantastic discussion. I really feel like we've put the world, job done. But no, this was a really wonderful chat. Thank you all so much for joining me and taking time to do that. Thank you so much. It's been really wonderful.
Thanks, Abby.
Thank you very much, Abby, and it's great to be with you guys as well.
Thank you. Absolutely. Thank you.